Morning, kids. Thursday, our last full lesson in U.S. history. Tomorrow we'll have a brief one, kind of a goodbye, and that would be it. But one last thing, and today's kind of the hardest one because we're going to talk about history in America right now, the most recent history. And that's the hardest to talk about. Yesterday, if you didn't see the lesson on COVID and the coronavirus, just a couple quick things to take away from that I hope it sunk in with you. You're living through history right now. What's happening right now is history. Years from now, you'll look back at this. We can't tell what the long-term impact of COVID is going to be. Already some school districts like OPS, they've talked about this is making them get technology. Laptops. We at Bennington already have the one-on-ones, the Chromebooks. Well, other districts are going to have to do that because this might just be a fact. Maybe in the fall, more schools will be out. Colleges are going to have to take a look at that. And it's going to change a lot of things. It's going to have a long-term impact on the economy and everything else. So I told you yesterday to see if you could find an artifact or souvenir or two of this era so that you could share with your kids, or you'll have years to look back, like maybe a mask or something else, or pictures that you print out of the going to the store and the meat aisle's empty or something like that, or something like that. All right, today, Obama, Trump, and what's happening in the world right now. First off, I want to remind you again, I'm neutral. I'm not Republican. I'm not Democrat. I'm an independent. I am neutral, and I try to keep my mind open so I can look at all sides of stuff. And that in America today seems like a rarity. America's polarized now like I've never seen it. I mean, the last thing I can remember this close even was like in the 60s when I was a kid with the Vietnam War. That really split America, those that supported it or opposed it, But I think you have to do, today in U.S. history, we do have to look at these two topics. But not totally, and I'll tell you why. Because first off, it's too soon. The best way of looking at it is this. You take the number of years a president is in office, okay? Like if you're one term, you're in for 4 years. If you're two terms, you're in for 8, okay? For however long a president was in office, you have to wait that many years when they get out of office before you can fairly and neutrally, effectively judge what kind of a president they were and what was their impact on America. You can't do it really while they're in office because you can't see how everything plays out. Obama was in office 8 years. You really need to wait 8 years after he got out to look back at his presidency effectively and then not only take a look at it, but evaluate it. It's the same thing with Trump. Trump's been in office 3.5 years now, and you're going to have to wait till he gets out, however long it's going to be. And that's how long you need to wait to take a look at it, too. Now, that's not the same thing as having an opinion. Everybody in America seems to have an opinion right now. You know that. But keep in mind that, like what I just said, you have to wait to get a good picture. And then you have to get through the emotions. In America today, again, people don't listen anymore. We argue. We yell. We post our things in, the Facebook battles and stuff of older people. But what it is emotion. And we're not able to look or evaluate people effectively, too. And that makes it really hard because very few people are completely evil or completely good or completely anything. You have to look at the pluses and the minuses. Richard Nixon, if you just focus on Watergate, got to be one of the worst presidents ever. Was lucky he wasn't impeached. He resigned first. But Richard Nixon was a very complicated man. He inherited a war that was tearing America apart. And you have to look at, because of that, it forced him to do things to change history. He went to China. He went to Russia. That changes history. Because by going to China and Russia, that's the first seeds that's going to lead later on under Reagan and all of the treaties, the SALT treaties and stuff like that. And that later on will lead to, Reagan and then the start SDI and stuff like that, which will lead to the fall of communism. So it's really hard if you just say Watergate, that's Nixon. Well, it's not because he did other things too. And it's tricky, Carter signed the Camp David Accord. Well, no, he put the Camp David Accords together where Israel and Egypt could sign it. That was a peace between Israel and Egypt, and they haven't gone to war since. But then the whole Iran taking our embassy, that's a huge thing too. And so at the time, there were a lot of people that had different opinions about Carter, and then later Reagan and Bush and Clinton, etc. So it's really tough. When you look at Obama and Trump, it's tough to go ahead and look at them subjectively and take away all that emotion. With Obama, in in 4 years, I think historians, when they start looking at textbooks, will start talking about, you take a look at a person's presidency. What did they get done? What laws were passed? What initiatives did they push? George Bush had 1,000 points of life. It was a really important thing to him, the humanitarian part of it. But again, George Bush's presidency is really, it's 9/11. It's the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. So it's hard to pull the pieces apart and look what he got done and other laws that he got passed. With Obama, I think you're going to be looking at Obamacare. I think that's what the history books will look at a lot. Obamacare, the law that every American needed to have insurance, and how you get that insurance, the program that you show this government set up, that'll be talked about in the history books. And it's too soon. It is a lot of Obamacare has been dismantled, but there's still parts of it there. And with the COVID virus, how is that going to affect things? How that will affect people's opinion? So it's tough to look at Obama or Trump that way. With Trump, I think the history books, for the first part, other than all the controversy, take a look at the Trump administration. They got a major tax cut passed, and that did explode the American economy. Up until the coronavirus, our economy was huge. Dow Jones hits 29,000, but the coronavirus has just stuck it right in its knees. Now, see, that's why you can't look at Trump and say, well, good or bad or success or not, because we can't see the end of this. Does the stock market keep going down? Does it stay? Does it go up? They keep talking about like a V depression where the coronavirus goes like this. We get all our measures and then it comes right back up. We don't know. And so it's really hard to take a look at the long-term impact of his tax cuts. Or he got a lot of judges appointed, 2 Supreme Court justices and stuff like that. What will the long-term impact on that be? Eisenhower appointed a Supreme Court justice who turned out to be very, very liberal. Eisenhower was a conservative, he was a Republican. And it was a big disappointment. But that Supreme Court justice would go on to change the Supreme Court a lot. And the decisions that they came up with, there was a long-term effect. So to look at Trump and Obama, you have to have a little time. It's got to pass. And then you can see what the impact was going to be. And a lot of times, it's weird. Jimmy Carter, when he left office, he still had the Iran-Contra cloud. I mean, not Iran-Contra, I mean the Iran hostage thing cloud over his head. We had Americans that were being held and they couldn't be released. Reagan gets elected, and he convincingly, years later, Jimmy Carter, as an ex-president, gets involved with Habitat for Humanity and charities around the world. And I think it changes how people look at him. Richard Nixon, after Watergate, was a disgrace. But years later, people started thinking, well, maybe about this. And once the emotions moved, people could look at it a little bit better. And when he passed, people were saying nice things about him I didn't think ever would. So it's tough you've got to let the time pass to let the emotions cool. And then you could also take a look at what they got passed and the long-term impact of that. Okay? So our last history lesson is a cop-out. You want me to tell you what I think about Obama or Trump. That's not my job as a historian. And I've got a master's degree, What we do is we take a look at what happened, evaluate what the impact was. And I'm telling you right now, it's too soon. It's too soon to tell what the impact of both Obama and Trump is going to be. I'm not saying have your opinion. I'm not saying who you support or don't support. I'm just telling you, as a historian, history, I have to let it settle just a little bit before you know really the impact. World War II, 1945, we won. We beat the Nazis. We beat the Japanese. We stopped aggression in Europe and the Pacific. Yet less than 2 years later, a new war starts, the Cold War. We could not have seen that on VE Day. Just recently here, we celebrate the anniversary of Victory Europe Day in 1945. And Victory Japan Day will be in August, okay? But we couldn't see because we were so excited about that, we didn't notice a couple of big things. We didn't notice that the Russians weren't giving away their part of what they conquered. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill would later say, has descended, and it did. But also the American economy, as those soldiers came back, there was a huge time of unemployment right after World War II. When we stopped making tanks, bullets and stuff, and all these soldiers came back home and there were no jobs. But within a year or two, the GI Bill would open up the housing market in college, and that would change America too. So, our last day of history, I'm trying to tell you, we're not going to look at so much what Obama and Trump did with America, we're going to take a look at what they did in office. And to do that, you can look at the headlines, During Obama's term, Osama bin Laden was killed. But was that something he did or something? And what was the long-term impact? During Trump's term, we're getting out of Afghanistan. What's the long-term impact? Are we going to stay or not? And a lot of things happen. And I would tell you this also. There's some things happening in the world that are really important that years from now we're really going to point at, but people aren't noticing now because they're so focused on all the controversies today, the political stuff. And again, it's an election year. I hate to turn on the TV and see all the commercials, both sides. It just drives me nuts. And the COVID has just sucked all the news out of everything, and there's no sports. We're all focused on the coronavirus numbers and stuff, and they're horrible. But there's a couple other things that are happening there right now in the world that you should pay attention to and keep an eye on. Very quietly, oil prices have dropped. If you drive to Cubby's or you drive over to any of the gas stations, you'll notice the prices today are the lowest probably in your lifetime. Well, since you've been driving, which means you haven't, not too many years. But why? Because Russia and Saudi Arabia both decided not to work together, and they both pumped as much oil as they could at the exact same time because of the coronavirus. Country after country was shutting down, and the demand for oil dropped. People weren't driving because those two countries had such a huge supply, and the demand dropped. That cratered prices. Now, that's a good thing for you as you drive. It's very good. And for your parents and people like me who remember gas at $3.50 a gallon and stuff, that was bad. So it's good. But there's a couple other long-term impacts. Before this, America was producing so much oil because of new technology called fracking. We were getting oil out of places we couldn't before. You drill holes in this rock. You go ahead and you pump down steam and other stuff, and you break the rocks. You free the oil from it. That's expensive, but we were extracting a lot of oil. Now, when the gas prices drop, that is no longer practical. And a lot of the companies that were doing this are now all of a sudden in a bind and are going bankruptcy. This is going to have a long-term impact on the United States as they shut down wells. States like North Dakota, where they had been getting all this oil, all of a sudden their economy has shifted. 5 years ago, North Dakota is booming. Today, they're closing things down because it's too expensive to pump that oil out of the ground. And all the oil that has been pumping, because they just can't stop and on a dime, has filled up all the storage we've got, which means that we have a glut. And that's affected oil prices, and that'll have a long-term impact on the economy because there's also less people flying right now. I mean, getting on an airplane now with COVID and being stuck on an airplane with all those bodies is something a lot of people are nervous about. Well, what does that do long-term to our airlines? Will airlines go bankrupt? Will it force them to change? If you've flown on an airline, they're not comfortable. And them seats have been, as close together as they can so they get as many people on their airplanes as they can to make as much money. But if we don't find a vaccine and this disease is going to be a problem, or it changes how people think, are the airlines going to have to change their planes? Are they going to have to give us more room and stuff? Will they have to limit flights or how many people on it? There's a long-term impact. Two other things I want to throw out. Last week, I was reading the paper and went, what the heck? And the word Bay of Pigs came out. I go, what? Right now, Nicaragua has a president that is very authoritarian, and the United States is in a position where we don't like what they're doing in their economy. The economy of Nicaragua is just cratered. It's cratered. Kind of like Germany during the 1930s when the inflation was excessive and people are just really suffering. Well, anyhow, we've been trying to get the guy that's in charge of Nicaragua out. He's not going to go. Dictators never leave. But this week, a couple of Americans were arrested in Venezuela for invading Venezuela with a bunch of Venezuelan refugees, people who'd been in the Venezuelan army and police and didn't like this leader. And they trained them, and they were going to invade, just like the Bay of Pigs. And just like the first Bay of Pigs, it was a disaster too. Very quietly, very few Americans have paid attention to that. But it is like history repeating itself. The Bay of Pigs, or like with the Sandinistas and the Contras in Central America during Reagan's term. And that's affected it. And this is going to be, once this collapses and those people arrested, there'll be ramifications in Venezuela and with America in all of Latin America. Just like after the Bay of Pigs, that changes how Cuba and the United States have we put an embargo on them, and that stays all the way up until when Obama's president. But this is also going to have long-term impact. And one more thing to think about, because we talk about history. We talked about in the 1920s, the stock market crash. Now, history never repeats itself exactly. The 1918, the Spanish flu was one thing. Today, there's a lot of similarities between the COVID and the Spanish flu, but it's not the same. But here's the deal. The stock market was at 29,000. It was booming. It was exploding this winter. Everybody was making money, except us teachers. We don't. Me and the sloth were poor. But COVID has just, these stay-at-home orders shut the country down. Gas prices cratered. No airlines, they're not doing that. Boeing's not building planes right now. They're not building cars in Detroit. All of a sudden, that changed everything, the dynamics. And we didn't see it happening. We just assume, oh my God, everything's happening. And we start tying the stock market to this. But I saw a thing yesterday, and then I always listen to NPR. So I was listening to NPR and BBC. I always love BBC. BBC's and Reuters give a look at America from a European point of view. But they were talking about, unemployment in America is at Great Depression type levels. So much of America, mostly because of the shutdown orders and everything else, it's out of work right now. And just like 1929, people had money in the bank when the stock market crashed. It won't be the same because we won't have the same banking crash that we had back then. We've learned from that the banking system is solid now. We have the FDIC, which protects our banks. But what about the economy? Will it come back? Will it not? That's a huge thing. And it changes a lot of things. This has become a recession. And yesterday, the head of the Federal Reserve was talking about how it's going to damage things. And if you have family members that aren't working right now because of COVID, or if you have relatives or friends, there's a lot of people out there that are uncertain. And that uncertainty causes unrest and a lot of problems. And we don't know because we're not done with this. I hope it's a short thing in our economy, but it might not. But that's history. To the people living it right then, they don't see it as history. It's not till you look backwards that you can kind of evaluate. It's kind of like in your life. Things happen in your life and you don't always understand what it actually means until later, I was in the service and I got out of the service. I was going to be a minister. Well, I was in the service. I cussed too much. I'm a sailor. I can't help it, But I got a job with mentally challenged kids in St. Louis, and I enjoyed it so much that once I left the seminary, I went into teaching because I really liked teaching. And I found over the years I like teaching you kids. You kids make me laugh. I wish I made you laugh with my jokes, but they're dad jokes, okay? I'm a dad. But I love teaching, and I never would have seen it. So you think the path is like this, but it's not till years later that you see the things that happen along the path get you where you be. And that's the thing about history. You can take a look at all the stuff. Because of Nixon, we get Carter. The Republican Party was on a downhill spiral. After Carter and the hostage thing, where we didn't get the hostages back, you get Ronald Reagan, who changes the South from a Democratic base to eventually Republican. Today, the South is a very solid conservative base. Whether Republican or Democrat, the conservatives usually, it's changed history, and that might change back or not. See, history is one of those paths that America takes, and we think it's a straight path that's always going to be. But at any time, any point, things can happen. What if John F. Kennedy isn't shot in 1963? How does that change the Vietnam War? What if Bobby Kennedy or Martin Luther King aren't shot in 68? What if the Watergate burglars weren't caught? There's so many things in history, kids, that keeps happening. That's why you got to pay attention. Watch the news, see what's going on in the world. And then as you watch stuff, try to think, and listen past the hype. Try to understand what the people are talking. Take a look at the different networks. There's conservative networks and there's liberal networks. What are they saying and what's their bias? What are they trying to convince you of? And take a look at a different viewpoints and stuff and try to understand what's going on in the world. And also try to be smart, Hey, right now we're talking about, toilet paper hoarding and COVID. Remember when it just started? But those people who were thinking about it ahead of time said, hey, this is coming. This is what's going to happen. Those are the people that seem to always be ahead of the curve. And the way they do that is by trying to pay attention to what's going on what looks like is going to happen, and then what's the long-term impact of that. All right, I know it's a long rambling history lesson, and I apologize for that, but tomorrow is the last day for juniors, and that'll be the last day. So I'll say goodbye to you tomorrow. But this was just a quick thought of history of where we're at now, and not just COVID, but everything else. Have a good day, kids.